Welcome in the latest episode of the Five on the Floor show on 5 Reasons Sports Network. Also can be found on Nothing But Net. That's a channel on Dash Radio. We're there every day, Monday through Friday, every weekday from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Eastern, 7 to 8 a.m. Pacific. Also check out 5reasonsports.com. That's 5reasonsports.com, spelled out F-I-V-E, for all of our latest columns, articles. Those are free, by the way. We don't charge like the local newspapers. Also, you can get all of our podcasts, 3 yards per carry, coming back in a week after a brief hiatus. 5 Rings Canes has a big guest this week. Balls Cast, Light Skin Opinions, Shulable, and more. Also, you can get our YouTube channel there or directly on YouTube. Our Loaded Bases show restarting again for Marlins season, and our 90-minute strong show starting as Inter still looks for its first win as an expansion franchise. Also, check out all the great sponsors in the 5 Reasons Sports Network, including one that we will admit is one of our favorites, Biscayne Bay Brewing, the official craft beer of Inter Miami and the Miami Marlins, which is South Florida's actual independent brewery. Also happens to be the official beer now of 5 Reasons Sports. Biscayne Bay is owned by local guys who employ people in this community to make their beer right here in South Florida. These guys are committed to our community and support 5 Reasons Sports so we can keep bringing you all the local sports content that you can handle. If you care about supporting local business and drinking amazing beer, grab their stuff, whether it's Marlins Lager, Miami Pale Ale, Tropical Bay IPA, at all major retailers throughout South Florida. It's the beer we're drinking now, 5 Reasons Sports. I got some in my fridge, on my bar, and I'm sure Alf is going to be asking me for some here pretty soon. So check it out, Biscayne Bay Brewing, and whenever we can again, we will be having watch parties at their new brew house, which is going to be down in downtown Miami. And now, today's episode.
Welcome to 5 on the Floor, a Miami Heat and NBA podcast from Ethan Skolnick with Alphonse Sidney, a.k.a. Alf954. Brought to you by the 5 Reasons Sports Network.
All right, Ethan Skolnick back on 5 on the Floor. Here's today's floor plan. We're going to talk a little bit about the calls that the Heat had tonight. They were late tonight. We're coming to you on a Sunday night. Eric Spoelstra, also Gabe Vincent and Myers Leonard. I think Myers is still going as we speak. That could go on for quite a good period of time. Also, one thing I should have mentioned, we've got new T-shirts, including our one of them is our drip shirt for Tyler Hero, which I've been teasing here for quite a while. Also, Bubble Dribble, if you were a fan of the video game Double Dribble, you'll like that one. You can get those through our website at 5reasonsports.com, but it actually takes you to a pop-up site. And those shirts for another 24 hours are just $14. So if you can get on there and you can get some discounted shirts, and these are limited edition shirts, they're not going to stay on as long as some of our others. All right, the floor plan today, I've got Alex Toledo. You can follow him at Tropical Blanket. I've got Greg Sylvander. You can follow him at Greg Sylvander. Again, we're going to talk about these calls that the Heat had today. Eric Spoelstra, Gabe Vincent, and Myers Leonard. Also want to talk a little bit about the NBA's decision not to allow Jimmy Butler to go nameless on the back of his jersey. We're going to get into the NBA's other decision, which is sort of end the awards race now before anybody plays any more games, and how that affects some of the Heat players. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about the Boston Celtics today, because we spent a lot of time on Floor is Yours talking about the Milwaukee Bucks, but the Heat might have to go through Boston too if they want to get to the finals. So we'll talk about what went wrong in those matchups. Let's start here, guys. Alex, you just came off the call with Eric Spoelstra. Anything specific that came to mind?
Well, honestly, I thought something that kind of was talked about for a good amount of time with Spo was tinkering, and it was something that you mentioned in the call as well as a couple other reporters, and for some reason that was just something that stuck out on this call, and I thought it was really interesting. It's something that we've talked about, and he mentioned specifically that he reads stuff, he listens to stuff, and knows that people have been kind of saying that that's something that can really happen with a lot of teams, is tinkering and adding stuff to the playbook or addressing weaknesses. But he feels like at the same time as wanting to address weaknesses, you kind of got to get going right from the start, because you don't have that much time to get acclimated with your team after not playing basketball for 3.5 months or however long it's been. And I thought that was interesting, because it falls into a lot of what we've been talking about, kind of how they're going to address their weaknesses, specifically defense.
And he talked about defense a lot. Greg, one of the things I asked him, my specific question, because I wanted to see if I got any reaction from him, because one of the things about these Zoom calls is that they can't really see us now, but we can see them. And so you can kind of see how the person responds to your question. So I asked Eric about whether or not you can believe everything that you're hearing from other teams now that there may be a lot more disinformation being thrown out there. And I mentioned specifically, well, we've been hearing that Ben Simmons might play the 4 for Philadelphia. So I wanted to see if there was any reaction to that. There really wasn't. But I can tell you that Eric is one of these people that follows everything that goes on in the league. Sometimes I remember when I was covering other teams, he would kind of pull me aside when I came back from those trips to ask what I saw or what the guys were talking about. So he does follow the rest of the league. I guess we'll start here. How much do you think we can believe what other teams are saying now?
Well, I mean, I think that there's obviously going to be some gamesmanship, but there's certain things like Ben Simmons at the 4. There's been a lot of people that have been proponents of that. So when you see examples of that kind of stuff and those shifts happening, I think that maybe some of that we can buy into, but there's inevitably going to be guys that we're not talking about that become factors in playoff series particularly. And I think that that's one unique advantage that Spo has with this roster. We've always talked about how we wanted him to get to a point where he had his roster. And with so many interchangeable pieces and parts, I think that he's going to have the unique ability to tinker a little bit, but everybody, because they kind of seamlessly fit into these same roles, because you have so many interchangeable parts, you're going to be able to plug and play guys, and people get a little bit more comfortable. You have a lot of guys that are comfortable getting minutes and spot starting and stuff like that. So I just think that when you don't have like a clearly defined 7 guys that you know are going to absolutely play, and the rotation extends out a bit, that it allows him to tinker, but safely tinker.
Well, actually, it's funny because Myers Leonard, right, when I got off that call, Alex was talking about that, about how, and he didn't even mention himself, but he mentioned a lineup that got thrown out there that could basically switch everything. I guess it was Bam, Jimmy, Jay, Andre, and DJJ.
Derek, yep.
Derek, yeah. So, I mean, they're already thinking in those terms. I mean, Eric hasn't wanted to give away specifics. And, of course, Bam, as far as we know, now I had heard, let's clear this out right now. I had heard Bam would be there by tonight. There was no real question or answer to that on the call today.
Well, Ethan, I think you missed something on social media.
Oh, what was that?
There was a picture that he, I think, tweeted out that basically said, "Oh, we weren't without Bam on his birthday," and that made me think, "Oh, he's there." But then I look at the picture, and it's like his huge cutoff of Bam.
Yeah,
right, and his birthday.
So apparently, he's not there.
Okay, so he's not there, and that was the other thing. I mean, everybody's tweeting their tributes to Bam. Like even Gabe Vincent had something on his social media.
Don't forget Donovan Mitchell and Bradley Beal.
Well, they all are, of course. We're going to talk about that too. But everybody's been tweeting out their things, so we kind of got thrown off. That's not the reason I heard he was going to be there tonight. I've heard independently he would be there by tonight. But then there was this additional social media stuff that made us think it actually happened. Before we get back to the sort of Spoelstra, Vincent, and Leonard's calls tonight, I mean, Greg, you're hearing the same thing as me, right? They're supposed to be complete by Tuesday. That's what I've pretty much been told by everybody.
When we went into the weekend, all indications were that it would be at the latest Tuesday. So that's why, to be honest, that I was a little surprised that we didn't hear or see or catch somebody maybe slipping up in a comment that Bam maybe had arrived. I don't know. Maybe he wanted to spend his birthday outside of the bubble. I don't know. I'm speculating there, but I expect them to be whole by Tuesday. I wouldn't expect everybody to be a go for the scrimmage. I think that's a totally different conversation. But all indications were that by Tuesday we would see everybody in the bubble.
And that's the other thing that Spoelstra said today. I asked him about the prep for the scrimmage. He said that he's talked to Luke Walton about some things. He said everybody available will likely play. So I don't believe that we're going to consider Nunn and Bam to be available. I think we'll probably see the other 15 all get run. And he also said that he's had to kind of talk to his coaches to calm him down a little bit about some of the things that he wants to try in this particular scrimmage. So this is Spo kind of fighting his mad scientist self. But let's get to a couple of the other comments that were made tonight. Yes.
Can I kind of add a couple things to that? Because Myers Leonard kind of went in on that whole thing on, the theory of their versatility and how they're theoretically very versatile. They can kind of, address any type of skill or, whatever is needed during a game. And I think that's something important because, like, I was listening to something today and what made me, they were kind of talking about the Clippers, Lakers, Bucks, and, which team from those stands out. And something important that I think applies here is that the Clippers have so much depth that they can kind of play any style against another team and match up versus whatever style and do a really good job, which kind of makes them the standout. And I think the Heat have some of that as well, where, they have a lot of guys who maybe aren't great defenders, but they do have a lot of different lineups they can play to address different styles. And I think that's kind of something we haven't really talked about too much as far as playoff matchups, where, as a playoff matchup goes along, you can kind of change and tinker, as Spo was saying right now. And I think that's kind of going to be something to watch out for.
Yeah, and I think that is kind of the point of the trades they made, was to give them – I think one of the things that we talked about all year was their depth, right? They had all this depth. And then, Justice wasn't playing. Dion was unplayable. JJ was somebody they didn't want to play. And so then
some people's eyes.
Yeah, then you started – you started to look up and you were like, they don't have 8 playable guys right now. I mean, they had some games, those back-to-backs where – he was pushing guys 35, 37, 38 minutes that he should not have been pushing that much. I think the one in particular was Dragic, that just was playing way more than he was supposed to be playing because they didn't have enough healthy bodies. And then they lost Goran. And at one point they didn't have Winslow and they didn't have Goran. They didn't really have a point guard. And then Jimmy was having to handle all that, and they didn't want that either. The point of the trade was to deepen them by at least 2. I don't think they're anticipating a lot from Solomon Hill. I don't know what they're anticipating from Gabe Vincent or Casey Okpala now, but they were trying to deepen the rotation and give themselves more flexibility. We've talked about this mixing and matching a lot, and not, all the lineups they can play, but the idea that you can be very defensive if you want to be. You can be very shooter heavy if you want to be.
Big or small.
Big or small. I think the only, to me, the only other team in the East – that, and I know Milwaukee, but again, Milwaukee has some very specialized role players. To me,
Milwaukee is kind of the opposite of what we're talking about, because Brook Lopez can't play any other positions. And, Bledsoe's one of their best players, but we know he struggles in the playoffs. So they're kind of going to end up probably going to more traditional looks, besides when they run Giannis at the center, which is probably their most dangerous version of themselves. But other than Giannis's versatility, the Bucks are very, very traditional.
Yeah, but I think so. What I was going to say was, I think the one team that's not is Toronto. I think Toronto is the one team that can play in a very flexible way, kind of like the Heat in the Eastern Conference. But they're really the only ones that strike me that way. I don't really view Boston that way. I definitely don't view Philly that way. They're kind of, regardless of how they're going to use Simmons, Simmons and Embiid are going to play. Richardson's going to be on the court at the end of games. Tobias is going to be on the court at the end of games. Those 4. There's not a ton of flexibility built into that. The Heat and Toronto have the most flexible rosters, and I think in a lot of ways have the best protection set up for certain guys going down with hamstring injuries or having other kinds of issues because of their depth and their versatility, which is a tribute to their development programs, really. I think because a lot of the guys we're talking about are guys that were not highly drafted.
Yeah, well, and also I think to your point, because you said, I think it was 3 episodes ago that you thought KZ could get minutes here. And I think it's an interesting thing when you open up the entire roster and you think about in these 8 games and in these scrimmages that Spo could potentially be comfortable enough to plug in a Gabe Vincent or plug in a KZ. Or even guys like Kelly Olynyk that have been up and down from a minutes perspective. I feel like every Heat fan would probably feel comfortable all of a sudden if you had to have Kelly Olynyk start a game here or there. So there's a lot of examples like that, and Jay Crowder and Andre Iguodala, obviously.
Even Solomon Hill.
Yeah, that obviously probably would be the least ideal of the options, but you're right. I mean, that's another guy that they could plug and play. And that's something that you're going to see them experiment early, but as Spo alluded to, I think that they're going to have to figure out who they trust quickly. And, the other thing that I saw, Ethan, that you tweeted was regarding Goran and being really ready to roll. And I think this all reinforces that he's going to have a really huge part in what transpires for the Heat.
Well, he is, and I want to get to that next, actually, and then I want to get to Jimmy's stuff, the award stuff, and then we'll talk about the Celtics.
Watch out for Gabe Vincent, by the way.
Well, look, they have made him a little bit more.
A little bit, right? Kendrick Nunn's not out there.
Well, but that's what I want to get to with Goran, because I feel like what's happened here with Kendrick kind of losing a week and a half, and I always feel we need to address this because we always get a couple on social media like we don't talk about Kendrick enough. We are planning on talking about Kendrick more. I think part of it is we know he's not out there right now, and I do think that there is. I've repeatedly said that before he was diagnosed with corona. I repeatedly said that I thought Kendrick could be a huge upside surprise for the Heat during this kind of situation, just because of the way he's handled some of these things before. And he got a bunch of time to rest his body after playing more than he played before. No playoff crowd, all that stuff. But I also think that now, one of the other things I've said is that, there's a chance that Eric's going to trust Goran the most because he's done it in these kind of situations. And Eric even mentioned international play tonight, which is something I've mentioned a lot. I think that there is a trust for Goran handling these kind of weird adverse circumstances because international play is very erratic. You have to deal with a bunch of stuff you're not used to playing with. You play in front of, you talk about playing in front of no crowds. He's played in front of no crowds. He's played in front of crazy crowds. He's played in all kinds of circumstances. You just have to learn how to focus and ball, basically. And so I felt that Eric was going to put more of a burden on Goran's back, not with minutes necessarily, but maybe with some starting assignments, maybe with the clutch time. And Eric made it seem tonight like he's leaning that way. I mean, part of it was because he was asked about Goran specifically, but he said he's ready to roll. We don't have to hold him back like we did in September. I don't know. You said, was it you who said on Floor's Yours, Greg, that you thought he was going to be their MVP of this tournament or this?
Yeah. I mean, obviously Jimmy and Bam, they're such easy answers. So that's the low hanging fruit when it comes to the MVP of the bubble kind of conversations for the Heat. But Goran, for all the reasons you mentioned, and like, there's even the part of it, and I don't really think he thinks about this as much, but maybe it has to factor in somewhere. I mean, he's playing for a contract and this like very concise period where he can put his imprint on the league and executives and talent evaluators throughout the league. I just think it's like the perfect storm for him to, as a veteran, go in there, get a lot of minutes. Jimmy trusts him. I mean, Jimmy loves having Goran out on the floor with him. So I think that it's all going to just kind of plug and play in a good way for Dragic going in.
Yeah, no, I think that's where this is headed. All right, let's get to a couple of the other topics, and then I want to get to Boston tonight. First one is the NBA's decision not to allow, Tim Reynolds reported this first, not to allow Jimmy Butler to go nameless on the back of his jersey. If you weren't familiar, this is how Jimmy basically decided to make a statement, which was by not using his name at all, to essentially say he was no different than anybody else. And again, the point is, if he wasn't a professional athlete, that he might be subject to some of the things that, other African Americans in this country have dealt with, specifically when it comes to the police and things along those lines. We talked on one of these episodes, and I'm sure we're probably going to get into it with Stan Van Gundy when we talk to him tomorrow about the NBA's decision to kind of limit the phrases. I didn't think they would force Jimmy to put a name on there. How do we feel about that?
Vincent Goodwill, of Yahoo Sports reported, this was 2 hours ago, contrary to reports, Jimmy Butler's jersey request is still under review and has not been denied. Butler wants to leave his nameplate on his jersey blank. Over 30 players have requested a blank nameplate on their jersey. I guess that Jimmy kind of sparked this idea. So I think that may turn the tides a little bit if that many guys are following suit here.
Well, I wonder which way it turns the tide. The first thing, Vinny has a pretty good tie-in to Jimmy's camp, so I'm sure I'm going to go with that being accurate. But I guess which way would it turn the tide? I wonder if the NBA would be more sort of pushed to allow it now, or they don't want 30, 40, 50 players running around without names on the back of their jerseys. And maybe they're less inclined. I don't know which direction that's actually going to drive them.
I mean, it just seems like such an easy, like, first of all, they've already I mean, I don't know how serious they take it, but they've obviously taken a little bit of heat for, people kind of saying that the name thing by itself isn't really enough. And that was kind of a sentiment that was being shared by the Heat on that Zoom call. And I think Jimmy kind of said something similar where they obviously got to do more than just the name stuff. And so I think this, just kind of having a blank name, is something that the NBA can afford to let them have, especially if you're talking about 30 guys.
I know.
We're like, you're just going to upset all these guys, especially for like in the circumstances that they're in, where they have to be away from their families. They have to sacrifice everything by coming out here to play so that they can, make their money and provide for their families who, again, they're without. I think this is something they can definitely accommodate.
Yeah. Well, and the other part of it is that, like Russell Westbrook is turning around and doing shooting shirts with additional phrases that I guess players were interested in having. So that I think that the kind of the limits and the guardrails that were put around the phrases that could go on the jerseys has kind of put a damper on maybe what could have been a bigger statement. So I feel like if you do get a subset of guys that want to go nameless, and they have a good reason behind it, it's not just something where they're not articulating why they want to do it and why it makes sense. I don't understand why they wouldn't accommodate those guys.
I also wonder, we see today, and we have to look in the context of other leagues too, because the NBA is paying attention to that. And the NFL today was a bleep show. I mean, it's just embarrassing. They've had months and months and months. They're known for not really caring about their players. And you had not like guys in the back end of the roster, not like the long snapper and the kicker. You had Patrick Mahomes, Russell Wilson, Drew Brees. So these are guys on opposite ends of the social justice spectrum. J.J. Watt. It was like big name guy after big name. And again, NFL players are not as recognizable typically as NBA players. And every name you've ever heard of was out there today challenging the NFL on their testing policy, on their transparency primarily. I mean, J.J. Watt had like an iPhone notes file that he posted up on social media. And J.J. Watt is the one guy in the league they do not want to F with for a lot of reasons, okay? I mean, he's probably the most prominent non-quarterback white star in the league, probably. And, he's out there, and he's been very vocal on social justice issues, too, I think in a way that would surprise NFL fans. And he was out there today basically saying, this is what we want. This is what we've asked for. The NFL looks terrible right now. There's some players are supposed to be reporting in 48 hours, the rookies, and they don't know they don't know anything. They don't know how many preseason games they're playing. They don't know anything. The NBA has tried to come off as the more, supportive league. They know what's going on in the NFL right now. And I don't think the NBA wants to lose its reputation as being the more supportive league. That is what would lead me to think that they'll bend.
Stand in solidarity with your players. Come on. This is such also in the grand scheme of things, if this is the statement that they want to make, it's not that, why do we need to stick to the letter of the law where they can only put their names in certain phrases? I feel like obviously you don't want to open up Pandora's box and let it be incoherent statements on the back of jerseys, but that's not what they're doing here. So I feel like they need to definitely support these guys.
Well, what do you think?
Do we think it might have something to do with sponsors being on jerseys and not on T-shirts?
I mean, yeah, but
that's just me, kind of thinking through it.
No, it could be, but I looked at some of the phrases and I really don't understand why they allowed certain ones, but others they didn't. There are certain phrases they allowed that I was surprised they allowed.
I wonder if they focus tested.
It's just a weird deal. I mean, what do you think? I mean, I don't want to get on a big political tangent tonight, but what do you? The Heat in particular, I think their approach has been interesting because Eric Spoelstra started his Zoom call tonight, by eulogizing John Lewis, which is something the president didn't do. I know where Eric stands politically, Okay. So I kind of know, I mean, he's not as out there as Stan or Kerr or Popovich, but I know where he stands, he stands politically, but nobody is as out there as those three.
Yeah.
But I just think that, I think the Heat's approach, which has been this pro-voting approach, is interesting because that is put in the context of voting out incumbents. So even though we might want to say like that the Heat haven't taken a political side, they have. They've made a calculation to take the political side of the majority of their fan base, which we know is different from the Dolphin NFL fan base. Well, I'm just curious what you've thought of it.
I mean, they've been using the hashtag Black Lives Matter, in many Facebook, Instagram, Twitter posts. And unfortunately, there's a faction of, the opposing side here that is in direct conflict with that entire movement and all of the spirit behind it. So I think just by virtue of putting that in some of the communication, it draws a line in the sand politically. And I know we don't want to go down this road too far, but I think that ultimately, it's a shame that it's came to that would be such a dividing factor, but it is. And so I think that they're on the right side of history.
Well, I think also we all are on the right side of history, but their fan base is different though, Greg. Like I don't think they're taking the chance that the Dolphins would be taking, for instance. Like the Dolphins, if the Dolphins are going to promote Black Lives Matter, even though they have a black head coach, a black general manager, a black assistant to the general manager, a black advisor to the general manager. Okay. I mean, Steve Ross has hired in a very diverse way. Okay. So whatever we think of Steve Ross's politics and his support for the president, there's no question that he's diversified his team, okay, in a way that probably 31 other NFL teams have not. But they can't be as out there as the Heat because the Heat's audience is different. It's different. Like it's majority going to agree with them. But I also think that its players, the organization's players are in support of it. It's a way to win favor with your players. I'm not saying they're not doing it from a genuine perspective, okay? But I also know there are conservatives inside the Heat organization, right? But it feels like the whole organization has gone totally to that end. And I'm a little bit surprised, okay? Well, yeah, pleasantly, but I'm a little bit surprised.
This issue should transcend politics. And unfortunately, that's like the sticking point, that it's not transcending politics because we're talking about human beings. So it's a pretty cut and dry conversation. And it's just unfortunate that it's so politicized and so charged that way. It's not surprising as much because I wouldn't necessarily have to say that every conservative in the Miami Heat organization wouldn't want to support Black Lives Matter, but there's so much of that right now that you're right, that it's good to see that they're getting behind the movement the way that they are.
The whole mask thing, by the way, that's also become politicized. They've definitely been encouraging mask wearing.
Yes.
At least a little bit.
No, they have, and they've been big time behind it. But all the teams, got behind that initiative. All the teams in Florida at a time that the governor is not mandating it. I know we've seen a sea change. I know with what's happened with the Washington racial slurs and everything else that's gone on. Like, there's definitely been a sea change, and the Heat is typically a progressive organization. But as we know, I mean, the team president is not a progressive. Okay, I mean he flipped his registration, which was a surprise. But he's not a progressive. There are others in the organization are, and I'll just say I've been pleasantly surprised that they've gone that direction as far as they have. I knew they would a little bit, and I knew also, Eric would. Yes.
Go ahead, finish your point.
No, but I knew Eric would. But and he is sort of the day-to-day face of the organization. But I didn't know that they would make it such a marketing thing like they have. They've basically taken a side. And Greg, I agree with you. There shouldn't be a side to take when it comes to racial, equality, and there shouldn't be a side to take when it comes to mask wearing. But they've taken, there is, unfortunately, and they've taken the right side, and they've been very overt about it. So.
What'd you have, Alex? You sounded like you were chomping at the bit to
Sorry, because I stopped so you could go.
No, because Ethan, then you said Lay, so I thought you were going to leap there. Just go ahead. I lost my train of thought already.
All right, you lost his train of thought. All right, let's get to the next thing. This is somewhat political.
Hold on.
Yes.
Hold on.
Right as I moved on. All right, go ahead.
There we go. Okay, no, but it's actually something that you've mentioned a bunch of times is the whole thing that happened with Mickey Harrison and Carnival Cruise, to piggyback off what you were talking about just now. And I wonder if also just doing some thought exercises, if part of the whole, how aggressive they've been with Black Lives Matter, and as you said, I'm sure they are genuine with it. I'm not doubting that at all. Has at least in part to do with the fact that Mickey got his bailout already, and it doesn't need to kind of he's not doing the waiting game, right? He doesn't need to worry about.
Well, he would tell you
anymore.
they didn't get it. He would tell you they didn't get a bailout. This is going to be a sticking point. I mean, I know.
Did the cruise industry not get a bailout?
They
in April or whatever.
Well, there was help, but it's not technically.
It wasn't as much as they wanted.
No, it's just not technically a bail. I mean, there's a conversation probably for another podcast another time. But I'm sure if we characterize it as the cruise industry getting a bailout, that there'll be pushback on that. I can tell you that. We know, obviously, and I've talked about this on Five on the Floor many times, we know what's happened to Carnival's stock price. I mean, I've rode it back and forth a couple times just trading it because it went down 75 something percent, and the Saudis bought a piece. I think they bought like 8% of the company at a very depressed price, and then it rode back up a little bit, and then it kind of went down again. I know that I have friends who are Carnival executives who've been laid off in the past 2 months. I mean, what's hit the cruise industry is very real. So I mean, I think again, politically, the Heat are known as a more progressive organization, but there are certain games that you need to play with politicians of both stripes. And the Heat owner has played them. I mean, he's donated to both parties over the years. There are certain things you do. It's not as overt as Steve Ross's relationship, obviously holding fundraisers for Donald Trump. But there has been a relationship there over the years. So, and I don't want to go too far off in this direction. I've found it interesting, and I find Eric to be relentless in a good way on this topic. And I'm just pleased that he's not stopping. That he's making it a focus. I mean, today he would not let us ask a basketball question until he talked about John Lewis for a minute. I mean, that was
the right thing to do.
He put it so succinctly when he said, "Oh, you see something wrong, something unjust, you got to do something about it." And I think that's really what this all comes down to.
Yeah, and I think, like I said, with Eric, it's genuine. It is completely genuine. I've had conversations with him in these areas, but I also think it is the kind of thing that your black players notice. That you have their backs, essentially. And I think that's a perception that the black players have come through the Heat organization have felt about their head coach. And I think that's a good thing. But anyway, let's get to the next thing here, and then we're going to talk about Boston a little bit. The NBA's decision to end any consideration for award voting now. In other words, not after the last 8 games of the season are played, but just cut it off now. But yet they're going to include the last 8 games of the regular season when it comes to season leaders and statistics. Can someone make sense of this for me?
Absolutely not. There's no sense to be made of any of that. Ultimately, I think it's probably a good idea to just base the awards on the games that have already been played and don't use this 8-game sample size added to it. For the sheer fact of that we have a sports media and fan prisoner of the moment situation that will go on. And if you add a Dame Lillard average 57 points over the course of an 8-game stretch, all of a sudden he's getting an MVP, like that, or not maybe not MVP, but you catch my drift. So I kind of feel like using the first part of the season is the right thing to do, but it is bizarre when you're going to start to then factor in the statistical components of the last 8 games, because obviously that's going to look different on, the stat sheet versus the awards. But from a Heat perspective, I think it's a really good thing, because to me, it kind of locks Bam into that most improved player spot. And yep. I think that was a really important thing. We've all talked about the leap and no ceiling and this and that, and this will validate a lot of that. And there's only more leaps to be taken. And then, there's also the defensive player stuff. I think Bam has the opportunity to make an all defensive team now, Jimmy as well. So all good things there. I'd love to see Goran get some 6-man votes, but there, there could be a couple guys ahead of him there. But ultimately, I think it's good for the Heat.
I think so. I think, Myers Leonard said tonight, maybe if we have some time tonight, you can throw that sound on here at some time before the end of the episode, Alex. But, Myers basically was asked about most improved player and said it's Bam. We saw him evolve into a star before our eyes. He didn't mean to disparage Duncan.
Superstar, by the way.
A superstar, but he's made that case repeatedly. Of course, when I asked Bam who MIP was, he said Duncan. You asked Duncan, he says Bam. I make the case.
Myers addressed that, by the way.
He did. Okay. What was his view on it?
He was basically saying that Duncan is right up there and that he feels like there's actually a lot of good candidates, but that Bam is the one that's kind of had the biggest leap as far as individual as well as kind of his impact for winning on a team where Bam is kind of him and Jimmy are the centerpieces. So I think he kind of weighed that a little bit more. And I thought it was interesting, by the way, what Leif said, because that does lock in Bam a little bit more since you take out these last games. That means the Pelicans are out of the playoffs and by 3.5, 4 games. And I think winning is something that kind of comes into as a factor when these awards. And if you're kind of doing tiebreakers between, let's say, Ingram, Brandon Ingram and Bam, that might be a big one. So I think Leif has a pretty good point there.
You know what I also think? I think the NBA did not want to put itself in a position of the wrong guy getting an award because of hype. I know that's
Rookie of the Year.
Well, I think with both. I think with Rookie of the Year or with MVP. So in other words, you were getting this hype train for Zion for Rookie of the Year over Morant, even though he didn't play enough games, and you're getting this hype train for LeBron for MVP over Giannis, even though there really is no case to be made for LeBron, and I'm a LeBron stan. There's no case to be made. Okay, I love our guys over at Clutch NBA at 5R, but when
he's number 2, he's a
they
nice
put
number, very
fine.
good number
He's number 2, but I mean, he's not even leading his team in most categories. All right, and I'm not saying he's not number 2, but there's no case to be made for him over Giannis this year. There's just not. I mean, just because he's older, like you don't get a crutch because of that. Like it's terrific, and he absolutely deserves consideration, but he does not deserve to win. But it's almost like the NBA sort of saw where this was going and doesn't want the embarrassment of that, whether it's LeBron or of Zion, and just decided to end it. I think the other thing is, if the awards voting is over, Kendrick Nunn's probably going to finish 3rd in Rookie of the Year voting, right? Most likely. I mean, probably Morant, Zion, and Kendrick. I mean, I would think, right? I mean, there's no.
Yeah. It might. The only one that they might put over him is RJ. RJ Barrett from the Knicks, just because he kind of has a lot of that as well. He had some big per game numbers, and a lot of the hype, was known as the best player before they played in college. So I wouldn't be surprised if he ended up coming out 3rd. But I think that's another good point, though. Nunn might actually finish top 3 there.
He'll be finished top 3. I mean, the Heat have not had a lot of guys finish top 3 in Rookie of the Year voting.
They might have 2 guys in the top 5.
They might. Yeah, they will. I think. Yeah, no, I think they will. I'll be interested to see too if some voters don't really pay attention to the fact that Nunn was better than Hero this year and put Hero ahead of him, just because there's more hype there.
Which will be really funny because of the injury that Hero, sustained, and he missed games. So,
right.
But you're right. Because I mean, obviously, and this goes back to the point that one of our listeners made about how come we don't talk about Kendrick Nunn as much. And it's definitely made us look inward, I think, and think about why don't we talk about him as much? And it ties back to the Bucket Bros, Hero, all of the stuff that we've seen from him, the flashy late game heroics and stuff like that. So it is an interesting dynamic, but I think ultimately the more that you're getting informed voting, that Nunn will end up, probably slotting in there at 3.
You would think so. I mean, we'll see how it plays out, but I do think the decision to count the stats but not for awards is I know the NBA is making a lot of this stuff up as they go along, but that one didn't make a lot of sense. All right, we're going to talk Boston and the Heat here in a second. Before we do, I want to tell you about another great sponsor of the 5 Reasons Sports Network, and that's Louis Peters, State Farm Agent. This is an agency representing the #1 auto and home insurer in the entire United States. More than 60 years of combined experience in the insurance industry. These are local agents that understand South Florida's unique market. They've got access 24/7 by calling in or clicking in. The phone number is 305-275-5585. That's 305-275-5585 or louispeters.com. That's LUIS Peters.com. He joined us in the podcast. He's a big Heat fan and Dolphin fan. They offer personalized service tailored to every single customer. There are no cookie cutter solutions in insurance. He just worked on something for me to try to help me out. You definitely should check him out. louispeters.com. And also, in addition to their office in Miami, you can find him on Twitter too, at SF Agent Peters. And again, louispeters.com. All right, let's get to it, Leif. While Alex and I were waiting for what seemed like forever for these for Heat practice to end and the Zoom calls to start, you were breaking down the Boston Celtics because we devoted an entire half episode of Floor is Yours on Thursday night to the Bucks, but it's actually the Celtics that gave the Heat more trouble this season.
They did.
Why?
It's a 2-game sample, so I think we all need to keep that perspective. And Jason Tatum missed one of those games. They were both prior to the deadline. So all that context needs to be remembered. But the Celtics won both games. As I look back on December 4th, Jimmy Butler had 37 in Boston. So, Jimmy was really productive against Boston overall, averaged 28.5, 53% field goal shooting.
That's crazy. They were a top 5 defense.
Well, yeah, and I'm going to get into some of that in a minute, but the guy that jumped off the page for me, and I didn't watch a lot of tape, to be honest with you guys, because I can't watch a lot of Celtics basketball. That's just not for me. But I did catch, Jaylen Brown was a monster. He averaged 28 a game in the 2 games. He had 31 and 25, 53% from 3. So I think when you look at that team, we've thought about Kemba Walker and his speed and how you're going to stay in front of him. And obviously Jason Tatum is a really, unbelievable offensive player, the way that he's growing. But Jaylen Brown has been a really a huge factor. So that was something that jumped off the page. The 2 other numbers, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts here. One was in the 2 games, Jimmy and Bam together were a -40. Did not expect to see that. And then the last thing was this. The Heat for the season were shooting 38% from the 3-point line. Against the Celtics, they only shot 31% from 3. And the Celtics, they're shooting 36%. They were all the way up at 38%. So it kind of flip-flopped on the Heat a little bit. And I think that that's going to be a recipe where they're going to need these wings that they've brought in and this infusion of Jay Crowder and Andre Iguodala. Maybe not as much Solomon Hill, but definitely those 2 guys. If there was ever a matchup that the players that they brought in were going to be most useful against, I think Boston is the team.
I think it's funny because you mentioned Brown and he did stand out. The guy who popped off the page to me was Hayward because he looked so different.
Yeah, especially that game in January, 29. I think he had 29 points or something.
Well, I think we've kind of forgotten what he can be. And what I just keep remembering from the end of that game was, Duncan Robinson picking up foul. It seemed like he picked up 30 fouls at the end of the game trying to guard him. I think that the problem with Boston, Alex, and we've talked about it a lot, is that we can talk about the wings that they brought in, bringing in Crowder, obviously, for physicality, bringing in Iguodala for his smarts and, the various guys that he's guarded over the years, having DJJ and all that. But the problem with all of it is that none of the Heat's wings like that, with the exception of Jimmy, if he's on, are as multifaceted as the Celtics wings. So it's you're taking, if you're going to try to guard them with your best defensive wings, you're going to struggle to push them on the other end of the floor. And I wonder if that's why Bam and Jimmy had trouble, because it's tough to surround Bam and Jimmy with enough shooting against the Celtics because your shooters can't guard their wings. So I think that's where you may get into trouble against them.
I think that's a really good point. That's probably a very good way of summing up the defensive issues, right? The thing is with the Celtics is they, specifically for the Heat, they cause just so many problems because of how many weapons they have in that starting lineup. And I think let's not also discount Daniel Tice, who I definitely made jokes about them kind of downgrading from Horford to him as their starting center, but he has been great for them as a role player. And part of their playbook is him sealing down on they kind of setting a screen first for a guy like Tatum or someone else who's going to drive to the rim, and then sealing once they actually get to the paint, sealing off the defender so that the person has an open runway to the rim. And it's kind of paramount to their whole playbook and how they get these guys open, because he's the one doing most of the screening. He's a huge body. So that's something that we've seen the Heat point guards struggle a lot with. And then on top of that, like you guys mentioned, Hayward and Jaylen Brown, who are probably the third and fourth best players, were guys who had absolute standout, crazy superstar games versus the Heat because of the fact that they have so many bad defenders, especially, they have Myers, Duncan, and Nunn in the starting lineup who all, the starting lineup is great overall, including on defense, but versus the Celtics, it just would not be great. So I think Iguodala and Crowder are just going to have to be huge versus those guys, like Leif said, because the perimeter is kind of their weakness right now. And I think the Celtics can abuse that in so many different ways. And those guys are going to have to be the keys.
Tice averaged 10.5 rebounds in those 2 games. And when you think about teams that are going to out-rebound and out-muscle the Heat, you don't think of Boston, right? And I think that this would be one of the few series where the Heat would size down and they put Bam at the 5 a lot. And I think an interesting element of that would be, do you think that the way this series would go, if you had Hayward and Jaylen Brown firing on all cylinders, and then you have Tatum to deal with? I mean, inevitably, you're going to have to try out a bio on one of those big wings. And
yes.
And that's where this starts to get interesting, because I do think that there's a potential that you could unlock further things with Bam on the defensive side in these matchups, because, I mean, who more useful than him to try to slow down some of these guys?
Let's just say it right now. Do we agree that Bam might be the best option to check Jason Tatum? Maybe not all game. We know that you don't want to kind of get him in foul trouble. You don't want to get him too tired, especially if he's going to have to be dealing with Tice, who's really big and physical on the other side at the other times. But Bam on Tatum, I feel like that's a card Spo has to use.
But he won't use it all the time. I think I think what we've hit on here that's problematic for Miami again is the two-way nature of Boston's players versus the one-way nature of the Heat's players. And the other thing I think that's going to be problematic is that Gordon Hayward is essentially almost another season towards recovery now. Like, we always talk about how it takes 2 years. Well, it's now 2 years.
To bolster what you're talking about, Hayward, somebody actually was tweeting about this the other day, and I was surprised at just how much his stats this year. Obviously, the per game doesn't compare to what he did in Utah as the 1A guy, but when you extrapolate his stats and impact per 36, he's almost identical to what he was doing in Utah on those winning teams. He's probably more or less the same guy, just with probably, let's say, 3/4 of the athleticism.
But extrapolate it again. What I would do is extrapolate it again from that Heat game forward. If you look at what he started, it was around that time. I'm with you, but I'm saying it got even better. If you look at it from around that time of that Heat game, it was like when he was just starting to feel his way back into shape. And remember, look, Brad Stevens coached him in college. If anybody's going to understand him, understand how to get him back to full health, understand what he's capable of, it's going to be that guy. The only question I've had was, can you play the 3 wings together consistently, still rebound enough when you're playing a 5'11" point guard?
And we've seen that answered so far this year, that the answer is yes. Because
the answer is yes.
They're one of the 2 best two-way teams.
They are, and a lot of that is Tatum's step. Yeah, no, it would be. I mean, like I said, I think the Heat's advantage over them is just sheer numbers. It's just Miami has more sheer numbers. Like I still don't love a lot of parts of Boston's bench. I know people are going to sell me on Marcus Smart and how important he is to them. But I still think that Marcus Smart becomes a liability at the end of some of these playoff games because I just don't think he's someone you have to guard. And you look at the rest of their bench, I still think they're even with Grant Williams, even with Tice, I still think they're a big short. So I do think they have some limitations, but I also think that they're the kind of team we've talked about, teams that in the bubble will thrive, this kind of college atmosphere. Well, they've got a young but kind of smart group. I think Danny's done a good job this time of bringing in bright guys. They don't have poison in that locker room anymore like they did with Kyrie. I just they are really dangerous. I mean, I just think, I am of the mind that Milwaukee is coming back to the pack. I just think that there's a lot of variables have been thrown into this that are going to make them closer to the teams that were behind them instead of further away. And then I look at Boston, Toronto, Miami in particular, all are dangerous in their own ways. But I think Boston's particularly dangerous to the Heat. I still, the more I look at it, the less I like it. I don't like the matchup for them.
Could not have said it better myself. Let's stay on that side of the bracket where we get Milwaukee. I know we talked a lot about them on Floors Yours, and let's hope that we talk a lot more about them because that's a better matchup in my eyes.
I think I might be the only one who still – and yes, I think the Celtics, like for all the reasons we've been talking about, are a tougher matchup just individually for the Heat and collectively. But I would still – probably rather bet on the Heat. If you're talking about the Heat winning, I would probably feel more comfortable betting on the Heat eliminating the Celtics than the Bucks. I'm afraid of the Bucks. I was actually watching some Bucks Raptors stuff from last year when they came back from down 0-2 versus the Bucks, and I just think the Raptors were so exceptional defensively as a collective, and the Heat just don't have that talent. I think that's kind of the tiebreaker where I think the Heat can really push them. But the Heat don't have the just the elite defensive talent from 1 through 9 that the Bucks had to create that build the wall defense.
Well, and they don't have Giannis, who as we talk about awards, he should get
Kawhi.
MVP and Defensive Player of the Year. And you've mentioned the Clippers a couple times throughout this, and I want to say that the more that I look over the rosters and who's coming back in the mix of players, I think that Kawhi is another guy that when it's just about basketball can really flourish in this environment. So, and the more that I'm sitting with this, I kept going into it saying it's the Lakers. I'm starting to lean in the Clippers direction a little bit the more that I sit with it.
I think it's the Clippers. I said Clippers before the season, but I feel that way stronger now. I do think that, I don't think the Rondo loss is a big loss, and supposedly he'll be back for the playoffs. But I
they
think
upgraded the position, Ethan. What do you mean? Dion and JR upgrades, baby.
The Avery Bradley loss to me, I thought he was important as another pro that they need. In addition to Danny Green, they just don't have a lot of pros on that roster. And I think that some of these guys are going to drive LeBron insane in this environment. I don't know. I'm not.
You think Dwight's been driving him insane lately with
Dwight's
all this?
Already starting. He's an anti-vaxxer. I mean,
he's an anti-vaxxer. He's anti-social distancing, which he said on in his own IG live. I mean,
well, Ethan, did you hear the breaking news that Dion Waiters and J.R. Smith potentially don't like each other?
Well, is that
news flash?
No. That was Dion and Kyrie, but they tried to start the Dion JR thing about them being traded for each other, and JR told the reporters to shut the hell up. It's going to be an interesting.
No, Dion told the reporters that, didn't he?
No, both of them did. I think. I mean, they just it's a little bit too much of a circus. I mean, I think the Clippers. I just think Kawhi in this environment. I agree with you. I think it is all about what he is, just like it is for Jimmy. I guess the other thing I will say, though, about a Celtics series with the Heat, Jimmy will need to be great because, I mean, you're talking 3 elite wings on one side and 1 on the other. He has to make them work. I mean, he has to be pressing the issue on offense and forcing – it's probably going to be Jalen guarding him most of the time.
And that's the other thing.
Forcing Jalen Brown to work.
Who they can both throw at Jimmy. They're both bigger and longer than Jimmy.
And the other guy's Bam. You would need Bam to absolutely dominate no matter who's guarding him. That's going to be a series where you want him to be exceptionally aggressive. And then Kendrick Nunn, like taking the challenge with a Kemba Walker. I know that that's a tall task, but like that would be the kind of matchup you'd want to see how he responds in that environment. And don't sleep on DJJ getting some minutes on Kemba too. I think
no, he
that's
would
something
too.
They would
put they learned their lesson there. They would put length on Kemba.
Like game 3, they would have DJJ starting.
Well, they'll put length on Kemba. They would run a number of different guys at Kemba. They got great respect for Kemba. All right, we covered a lot tonight. Check out 5reasonsports.com. Like I mentioned, we've got 1 day left. By the time you listen to this, we got half a day left on the big discounts. We're still gonna have the shirts up there, but if you want them for $14, the bubble shirt, the King of the Bubble shirt, the Jimmy Butler dribbling and the 5 a.m. shirt. We got one of those up there. If you want to get them for $14, you got to do it by the end of the day, Monday. All right. So by the time this airs, our next episode, as long as there's no snags, if he takes a 3-second break from Twitter, where I feel like he's stealing all of my takes, we're going to have Stan Van Gundy on with us on Monday. And I'm working on another big former Heat guest coming up in the next week, which I'm not even telling these guys about. So we'll see if that actually plays out. All right.
What?
Have a good night.
Thank you for listening to the 5 on the Floor on the 5 Reasons Sports Network.